Bill Porter left Nashville the following year and moved to Vegas. He worked for, or was an owner and operator of United Western, which was affiliated with Bill Putnam's United Recording out in California. And Hazen moves from Florida and goes up to work for Sid Nathan at King Studios up there. And he was working in the mastering department, plus doing some recording as well, and also helped upgrade those facilities. And it was about
the casinos. He did the Then You Can Tell Me Goodbye. I think was that the casinos? Is that it?
Mm-hmm.
He recorded that right there. Great soundtrack.
Oh, that's, yes. Then and it was about that time that Glenn Snoddy begins working for Acuff Rose, and he works on building their demo studio during the day, and then hired, was it the Crescent Company?
Crescent Company was the holding company that they owned bowling alleys and movie theaters around town, and they had a building they wanted to repurpose.
And that building was at 10th and Woodland in East Nashville. I put in put in something here that I found that that Glenn had recorded in 1964, and I thought it was I really enjoyed hearing it, so I wanted to put it in for this.
Baby, good to me, you know she's happy as can be, you know she said so. I'm in love with her and I feel fine. Baby.
That was the Charles River Boys Beatle Country album.
That's a long way from Abbey Road.
I think Chet did a record called Chet Picks on the Beatles around that time too, which is another one that's kind of easy to listen to. And another question too, I'm not sure about this, but I'm sure Gene can answer this for me. Your father moved from Nashville, and he actually purchased the studio from Bill Putnam to start Universal Recording. It was already there established, but I think Bill was actually trying to get rid of it, and your father was looking to build a new studio because Fred Foster wanted to build a new studio. I think your dad said, forget it, I'm going to move to Nashville and buy this one. Is that correct?
Correct. We got to Las Vegas in August of 1966. And the 1967 ad in the Billboard magazine hangs in my office in Las Vegas today. Pretty cool.
And this is what Kyle was referring to. Go ahead and play it, Chase.
Then if it don't work out, then if it don't work out, then you can tell me goodbye. Sweet.
In addition to that, Lee was interested also in remote recording, and he was a trailer for that. And also around that time, it was there was a console issue that came up with Glenn, and he had hired a company in New York that was supposed to build a couple of consoles, one for Acuff Rose and one for the future Woodland Studios. And he was not getting the results he expected, especially when he found out that they weren't built when they were supposed to be built, but the parts, I guess, were up there. So he and Grady Skelton of Electronics Equipment Incorporated in Atlanta had hired a truck, drove to New York, and picked up the console parts. Because they had found, there was a man who worked for Electronics Equipment Incorporated named Jim Pugh. And they were going to, and Jim and his wife were gracious enough to build those consoles in the basement of his house.
I think gracious is the right word.
But I believe we have some video of Jim talking about this.
I have a large basement, so I volunteered to use my basement. And in my basement, we built a 4-channel console for Woodland as well as Acuff Rose. And we built A cup rows yielded to Woodland in terms of who would get theirs first. And we went to work on it. Glenn would come down every couple of weeks and make sure that I and my helpers weren't sleeping or running off with his money. And I had two neighbors. One was a lawyer, one was a social worker. And you would say, well, now how could those guys build consoles? Well, believe it or not, they were very, very smart and had very good mechanical abilities, both from the understanding viewpoint and using their hands. And I hired a fellow engineer at the WGST, and between the four of us and Glenn coming down from time to time, we built the first two consoles, one for here and one for Acuff Rose. And my wife was introduced to a music star during all of this. We were working madly there trying to finish up the Woodland console, and one day three gentlemen came to our back door, and Glenn was there, and so she was getting tired of all this going on in our basement. She was getting tired of having to fix sandwiches. She was 6 or 7 months pregnant, and you know, she just wanted to get this over with and get it out of there. But as these three gentlemen, she told them, she said, come on in, they're down there in the basement. Just pointed to the steps where they could go down. And Don Gant and Roy Orbison and Ron Gant came down our basement steps. And we were pretty well along with the Woodland console. We showed Wes Rose what was sitting over there. All was sitting there was the plywood frame and base for his console, and he in his uppity way at that point looked at it and says, looks like a damned old cigar box to me. And I was up to here with it all by this time as well, and I took my finger and put it right in his face, and I said, look, fella, everything starts somewhere.
In 1968, now was Monument built by this time? Had they?
I think they moved into
Built
the studio about 68. Now there was a period of time that they weren't, the original studio was, as we were talking before, down at the Masonic Hall. But during the period of time they took the old church, it was a Cumberland Presbyterian Church built in 1853, and then it had become I believe an Elks Lodge and a bingo parlor, and then it took another step down and became a studio. But while they were reworking the studio, Fred and Mort and Tommy had moved all of their stuff to Music City and worked out of Scotty's place during that time. So there was a little overlap there, that there wasn't truly a monument. They were still doing their work, but they didn't have a building. But I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they opened a new studio in 1968 there at the corner of 17th and McGavin.
Now, I know we read that, you know, Lee moved to Nashville in 68, thereabouts, and did he start immediately at Woodland?
That precedes my time there, so I'm not sure if he started there right away or not. Glenn or Jim? Did Lee start at Woodland immediately upon moving to Nashville?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then it was over that holiday when the consoles were finished and Mrs. Pugh got her basement back. And I found this to be interesting. The official grand opening of Woodland was not only featured a live broadcast from Hoss Allen and John R. Broadcasting live music, but the mixer was Lee Hazen, and apparently it was his first day on the job. He'd been hired, what I read, it said he'd been hired that morning and put to work that night. Now, and then Gene, you moved here in 69?
About
And as I understood it, it was, some of your first work was with Wayne Moss at Cinderella?
yes,
Sound? Was area code 615 one of the first things you worked on, or?
yeah. I think some of the first things I worked on in Murray. And then that album was being made for area code 615 was being made with Ellie Major and Wayne. Anyhow, I don't know exactly what I'm saying.
That's all right.
Was that with the Flickinger console?
What?
Was it with the Flickinger console?
And Wayne Moss's?
Yes.
No, it was an old board that was a radio board with 3 channels. Patch faded, I built, just patch things to make them go where we wanted them to go.
Did you mark the patch bay the same way you did at Quad, only you knew where stuff went?
I would never do that.
And Jim, then, and that, you know, somewhere about that time, then that was when you were hired to be full-time? And what was that like, moving from Atlanta to, and relocating up here?
Well, it was a big job. It was a nice change. And now today, looking back at Atlanta and comparing it to this area, I sure am glad I moved. So it was an opportunity that I welcomed all my life, you know, that I could make that change. But it was a lot different than the music business as it was in Atlanta. Atlanta just had a couple studios. One was Bob Richardson and another fellow then named Rod Kidner. And I did some work for Rod while I was still there, some moonlight lighting, and it was definitely a challenge to come to Nashville, even though I knew the equipment very well. It was quite a challenge to come up here because I had never rubbed elbows with the big artists and the real professional engineers and all that crowd. But Glenn, in his graciousness, taught me and bought me, if you will, and just trained me in the way that he thought I should follow, you know, to serve the music community, and be forever grateful to Glenn for his mentoring and his instruction.
It was also during this time that Dave Harrison is up in Cincinnati. He's working for Sid Nathan King Records, and he is working on James Brown recordings. So Bill Porter goes on then to do live engineering for Elvis around this time.
Yeah, that's correct. I know that they were having problems at the hotel, and back in those days you had to be a union guy to work in the hotel, and it was something with the monitor system. And Bill, because obviously Elvis couldn't hear himself, so he calls Bill over, and Bill comes and brings over the old Shure Vocal Masters, if anybody remembers those, and puts them on the floor for Elvis. And the next thing you know, Elvis wants him to do live sound for him. I know there was an issue with the hotels because obviously Bill wasn't in the union at the time, but I'm sure Mr. Presley said, you know who I am, and that took care of that. So I'd just make another comment too with Bill, just for us engineers. He did Good Luck Charm in 1964, which is a #1 for Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley did not have another #1 until Bill Porter remixed Suspicious Minds in 1969 at his Las Vegas studio, and Elvis did not have another #1 after that. So I always try to say sometimes the engineer does make a difference to the artist.
Now Harrison moved down to, Dave moved everything down here from Cincinnati in about 68? Is that when?
It was closer to 7.
Closer to 7?
Yeah. Built the,
Oh, I'm sorry.
built the console in Cincinnati and one of the labs up there, and when that was finished, moved it down to the starting King facilities on Dickerson Road.
And then also, of course, Quad Studios opened in 1970 as well, which, well, we'll talk about that in a moment. Because one of the things that that Quad was known for was they began to be, starting with Neil Young and the success they had with Harvest on that record. Gene Eichelberger began to work with other artists coming in there, such as Joan Baez.